in a high-tech bunker in Nakhon Phanom, Thailand, thousands of miles away from the front lines. A massive IBM 360/65 mainframe hums. It is 1968. This is the brain of Project Igloo White, the most expensive, most secretive, and most technologically advanced operation in the history of warfare at the time. On the screen, a tiny green dot blinks. An acoustic sensor, disguised as a tropical plant and dropped from a Navy jet, has just picked up a sound in the dense jungles of Laos. To the American technicians, it's a clear signal, a convoy of North Vietnamese trucks moving south. Within minutes, coordinates are relayed to orbiting B-52 bombers. Thousands of tons of steel rain down, turning the jungle into a lunar landscape. The computer logs a confirmed kill. The mission is declared a success. But the next morning, as the smoke clears, the reality is chilling. There are no charred trucks. There are no bodies. In fact, just a few miles away, the real supplies, thousands of tons of ammunition and food, are already moving towards South Vietnam, completely untouched. For 8 years, the United States spent nearly $1 billion a year, nearly $8 billion in today's money, on a digital wall to stop a primitive trail. They used seismic sensors that could hear a footstep, acoustic buds that could detect a whispered conversation, and chemicals that could smell human sweat. Yet, by the end of the war, the Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't just operational. It had grown into a 16,000-kilometer concrete and steel artery that the world's only superpower simply could not cut. How did a nation of peasants outsmart the world's first smart war? How did they turn the very technology meant to track them into a weapon of deception? This isn't just a story of logistics. It's the story of how human ingenuity hacked the most advanced military machine on Earth. By 1967, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, realized that traditional bombing wasn't working. The trail was too elusive, too well hidden. His solution? If you can't see the enemy, you make the jungle talk. This was the birth of the McNamara Line, technically known as Project Igloo White. It was a plan to turn the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the world's first electronic battlefield. The cost? Nearly $1 billion per year. The strategy was a three-tiered technological net. First, the sensors. Over the course of the operation, U.S. aircraft dropped nearly 20,000 sophisticated sensors along the trail in Laos. These weren't ordinary devices. They were akubuoys, acoustic sensors designed to catch in the jungle canopy, disguised as tropical foliage, listening for the sound of truck engines or human voices. There were spike buoys, seismic sensors shaped like lawn darts with camouflaged antennas. When dropped from high altitudes, they buried themselves deep into the earth, sensing the vibrations of heavy tires or marching boots from miles away. They even deployed chemical sniffers, sensors designed to detect the microscopic traces of ammonia in human sweat and urine. Second, the relay. Because the jungle canopy was too thick for direct signals, the U.S. kept EC-121 Bat-Cat aircraft circling overhead 24/7. These flying antennas caught the faint signals from the jungle floor and beamed them to a secret location in Thailand. Third, the brain. At Task Force Alpha in Nakhon Phanom, the signals were fed into two IBM 360/65 mainframe computers, the most powerful computers in existence at the time. Inside this windowless, air-conditioned bunker, technicians lived in a digital reality. They didn't see the war, they saw blips and lines of code. When a string of sensors was triggered in sequence, the computer would calculate the speed, direction, and size of the convoy. It was war by algorithm. Within 5 minutes of a sensor being tripped, an F-4 Phantom or a B-52 would be dispatched, to coordinates they couldn't even see through the clouds. To the Pentagon, this was the future. They believed they had finally replaced the messy reality of guerrilla warfare with the clean, predictable logic of physics and mathematics. But there was one thing the IBM 360 couldn't calculate: the unpredictable genius of the people living under the canopy. While the Americans were looking at screens, the Vietnamese were looking at the sensors themselves, and they were about to turn this billion-dollar net into a massive trap. To the American pilots flying at 30,000 feet, the jungle looked like an endless, unbroken sea of green. But beneath that canopy, a miracle of engineering was breathing. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was never just a single road. It was a sprawling, interconnected spider web of over 16,000 kilometers of driving roads, river crossings, and hidden paths. If the US bombed one thread of the web, the North Vietnamese simply moved the traffic to 10 others. It was a living organism that could heal itself faster than the B-52s could wound it. But how did they hide thousands of trucks from the most advanced aerial reconnaissance in the world? The answer was the green roof. Vietnamese engineers developed a technique called Kin Kong Cao Tuong, closed gates, high walls. They didn't just clear the jungle, they manipulated it. They tied the tops of living trees together across the roads, creating a natural tunnel that was invisible from above. When the trees died from defoliants, like Agent Orange, they replaced them with artificial camouflage made of bamboo and plastic, woven so perfectly that even high-resolution cameras saw nothing but forest. And then, there was the Line 5000. While US analysts were looking for fuel trucks to bomb, the North Vietnamese were building something they never expected: a 5,000-kilometer secret pipeline. This blood vessel of the trail pumped millions of gallons of diesel from the north through the mountains of Laos and directly into the heart of South Vietnam. It was buried underground, hidden in riverbeds, and protected by anti-aircraft batteries. The Americans were hunting for moving targets, while the fuel was flowing silently beneath their boots. But the most incredible part wasn't the infrastructure, it was the disappearing act. When a convoy heard the roar of an approaching AC-130 gunship, they didn't panic. They didn't run. Within seconds, hundreds of trucks would vanish into massive underground parking garages carved into the limestone mountains. These caves were so large, they held entire hospitals, repair shops, and sleeping quarters for thousands of soldiers. One US pilot later remarked, "We would bomb a section of the road until it looked like the surface of the moon. We'd go home, sleep, and fly back the next morning, only to find fresh tire tracks running right through the craters." The Americans had the data, they had the sensors, but they were fighting a ghost that knew every inch of the shadows. And as we're about to see, when the technology failed to see the ghost, the Vietnamese began to use that same technology to lead the Americans into a deadly game of hide-and-seek. The IBM 360/65 at Task Force Alpha was a masterpiece of logic. But logic has a fatal flaw. It can only process the data it is given. And the North Vietnamese became masters of feeding the American computers digital lies. When the Vietnamese soldiers discovered the sensors, they didn't always destroy them. They did something much smarter. They studied them. They realized that the Acoustic were listening for truck engines. So, what did they do? They placed cheap, battery-powered tape recorders near the sensors, playing the looped sound of heavy diesel engines. While US Phantoms were busy bombing a pile of rocks where the sound was coming from, the real convoy was slipping past 10 miles away in total silence. Then there were the Spike Boys, the seismic sensors designed to detect the rhythmic thump-thump of marching boots or heavy tires. The Vietnamese countered this with a technique that was as primitive as it was brilliant. They would hang buckets of water on trees near the sensors. As the wind blew, the buckets would sway and drip, creating irregular vibrations that mimicked the movement of a small squad. Or even simpler, they would herd a group of cattle or buffalo across a path. The sensors would trigger, the computers would alert, and the US would spend $100,000 in ordnance to kill a herd of cows. But the most famous hack involved the chemical sniffers, the sensors meant to detect human urine. The Vietnamese soldiers quickly figured out that if they hung buckets of old urine or manure far away from the actual trail, the sensors would go crazy. The American analysts in Thailand would see a massive troop concentration on their screens, call in an airstrike, and bomb an empty field of fertilizer. One former US sensor technician later admitted, "We were playing a game of chess against an opponent who wasn't just playing the game. They were rewriting the rules every night." The electronic battlefield was becoming a hall of mirrors. The data was perfect, but the reality was a ghost. And while the Americans were frustrated by these phantom convoys, the Vietnamese were preparing their most dangerous secret: the ghost drivers. Men and women who drove the trail with their eyes closed, literally. While the IBM mainframes in Thailand were crunching numbers, a different kind of calculation was happening in the Truong Son Mountains. It was the calculation of survival. To stay alive, the North Vietnamese drivers had to master an art form that defied human biology. They had to become ghosts. The greatest threat wasn't the B-52s, it was the AC-130 gunships. These spooky planes were equipped with early night vision infrared sensors and starlight scopes. They could see a cigarette cherry from 2 miles up. For a truck driver on the trail, turning on a headlight was an invitation to a fireball. The solution was a nightmare of endurance called lightless driving. Drivers navigated mountain passes only 2 meters wide, with 1,000-foot drops on one side and jagged rock on the other, in total suffocating darkness. To see the road, they used ingenious tricks. They painted the rear differentials of the truck in front with white lime or fastened a white towel to the tailgate, giving the driver behind a faint ghost to follow. Some trucks had tiny shielded kerosene lamps mounted under the chassis, pointing directly at the front tires, so the driver could see just a few inches of the ground, but nothing that could be seen from the air. But when the fog rolled in, or the moon vanished, even these tricks failed. That's when the living markers stepped in. Thousands of young women, many only 17 or 18 years old from the Youth Volunteer Corps, lived in the most bombed-out sectors of the trail. Their job was to be the eyes of the drivers. During heavy raids, when the road was obliterated by craters, these women would put on white shirts or wrap themselves in white bandages and stand at the very edge of the precipices. They stood still, as statues, amidst the smoke and the falling thermite, acting as human signposts. A driver would look out into the blackness and see a faint white flicker, a human being standing on the edge of death, telling him exactly where the solid ground ended and the abyss began. They were called the living signal fires. The psychological toll was staggering. Drivers would spend 10 to 12 hours behind the wheel in high-tension silence, breathing in diesel fumes and dust, eyes straining until they bled. They developed tunnel vision so severe that many had to be physically lifted out of their cabs at the end of a run, their hands frozen to the steering wheel in a permanent grip. One driver's diary from 1969 reads, "The stars are our only friends. The machines above hunt us like wolves, but the road is our mother. She hides us in her shadows, and as long as we can feel her beneath our tires, the South is not far away." The US military had calculated the probability of kill for every truck. They estimated that for every 10 trucks that started in the north, only one would make it to the Iron Triangle. What the computers failed to realize was that the Vietnamese were willing to send 100 trucks just to make sure that one arrived. They weren't just moving supplies, they were moving a nation's will, 1 inch of dark mud at a time. If the drivers were the heart of the trail, the infrastructure was its circulatory system. By the early 1970s, the Ho Chi Minh Trail had evolved from a series of footpaths into a massive, industrialized logistical miracle that baffled the finest minds at the Pentagon. The Americans were looking for a road. What they found instead was a decentralized network of bin trams, logistics hubs hidden deep underground. Each bin tram was a self-contained city, spaced about a day's travel apart. They contained underground barracks, hospitals with sterile operating rooms, sophisticated communication centers, and massive fuel depots. But the crowning achievement of this primitive army was the fuel pipeline. While U.S. intelligence was scratching their heads over how the North Vietnamese were fueling thousands of trucks in the middle of a jungle, the North Vietnamese 559 Transport Group was laying down over 5,000 kilometers of 4-inch plastic and steel pipe. This pipeline started in the north, crossed the treacherous mountain passes of Laos, and reached all the way to the outskirts of Saigon. It was protected by gravity-fed pumping stations hidden in caves. No matter how many fuel trucks the U.S. blew up, the blood of the war kept flowing silently underground, moving hundreds of tons of diesel every single day. To protect this vein of the dragon, the North Vietnamese deployed the most dense concentration of anti-aircraft weapons in history. By 1972, the trail was guarded by over 8,000 anti-aircraft guns, from heavy 100mm cannons to heat-seeking Strela missiles. The electronic battlefield had met its match. U.S. pilots described flying over the trail as flying into a wall of red tracers. In some sectors, the anti-aircraft fire was so intense that U.S. sensor-dropping missions became suicide runs. The numbers tell a story of total technological failure. Between 1968 and 1972, the U.S. dropped over 2 million tons of bombs on the trail, more than the total tonnage dropped on Germany and Japan combined during all of World War II. The U.S. Air Force claimed they were destroying trucks faster than they could be replaced. Their computers showed a statistical victory, but the statistics were a lie. In 1965, the trail moved 30 tons of supplies a day. By 1974, despite the millions of bombs and the billion-dollar sensors, the trail was moving nearly 1,000 tons of supplies every single day, including heavy T-54 tanks and long-range artillery. The Americans had tried to win the war with physics. The Vietnamese won it with geography and sheer, stubborn persistence. The Ghost Road hadn't just survived. It had expanded, becoming a modern highway of war that was now ready for the final, decisive blow. By April 1975, the electronic battlefield had gone silent. The IBM mainframes in Thailand were unplugged. The sensors in the jungle ran out of batteries, becoming nothing more than plastic litter on the forest floor. On April 30th, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the streets of Saigon. Those tanks hadn't arrived by sea or by air. They had come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the very road that billions of dollars and the world's most advanced technology were supposed to have erased. The United States had fought a war of statistics. They measured success in sensor activations, confirmed kills, and tonnage dropped. They believed that if they could gather enough data, they could solve the problem of the jungle. But they made a fatal mistake. They confused the map for the territory. They saw blips on a screen. The Vietnamese saw a path to their home. The Ho Chi Minh Trail proved that in warfare, the human factor is the ultimate variable. You can build a sensor to detect the smell of sweat, but you cannot build a sensor to measure the depth of a person's conviction. You can calculate the probability of a bridge collapsing, but you cannot calculate the speed at which 1,000 volunteers will rebuild it by hand in the middle of a firestorm. Today, The trail is no longer a secret. Parts of it have been paved into the modern Ho Chi Minh Highway, a bustling artery of trade and travel. Other parts have been reclaimed by the jungle, hidden once again under the emerald canopy. But the legend remains. It stands as a haunting monument to a simple truth. No matter how high the technology, it can never fully conquer a people who have nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. The electronic wall fell. The sensors went dark. But the road? The road is still there. The story of the Ho Chi Minh Trail isn't just a chapter of the Vietnam War. It is a lesson for every modern conflict. It reminds us that behind every piece of high-tech weaponry, there is a human mind capable of finding a way around it. If you found this deep dive into the Ghost Road fascinating, hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. How do you think modern AI and drones would fare against the tactics of the trail today? Let's discuss below. And if you want to see more untold stories where history and strategy collide, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next Shadows of History.